If the prelude is about Wordsworth's attempt to find a voice for his poetry, Home at Grasmere is about his attempt to find a place for it. It is a poem filled with Wordsworth's desire to affirm that he has found the location from which and about which he can produce great works. Place, poetry, and self-identity are absolutely bound together here.
Home at Grasmere, I think, relates to the prelude. It belongs to the moment when Wordsworth was writing the early prelude. But it relates to the prelude, or that material, more by way of analogue than anything else, I think. In each of the versions of the prelude, Wordsworth follows a similar structure. A statement about childhood experiences and experiences in youth, education, lead to the moment at which the poet declares there is some great task yet unfulfilled ahead. The 13-book prelude ends with a declaration that he and Coleridge, fellow labourers in this work divine, are going to take up their great task once more. So does the 2-book version of the poem. Well, it's very similar in Home at Grasmere. Reference to school days, the dream fulfilled in the present, and then towards the end of the poem, the taking on, the recognition of a duty that must be fulfilled. And what is that duty? It is to speak, to fill the veil with the heroic trumpet, and so on. So the poem ends, as does each of the versions of the prelude, with an anticipation of future task.
Early critics of the poem read it as an almost embarrassingly joyful celebration of the move to Grasmere. Perhaps something of this is felt in the Happy Band passage, when Wordsworth describes the value of having his brother John, Coleridge, Dorothy and the Hutchinsons all around him.
Our beautiful and quiet home, enriched already with a stranger whom we love deeply, a stranger of our Father's house, a never-resting pilgrim of the sea, who finds at last an hour to his content beneath our roof. And others whom we love will seek us also, sisters of our hearts, and one, like them, a brother of our hearts, philosopher and poet, in whose sight these mountains will rejoice with open joy. Such is our wealth. O vale of peace, we are and must be, with God's will, a happy band.
In spite, or perhaps because of its joyous tone, the Happy Band passage was almost removed from the poem after the death of Wordsworth's brother John in 1805. Certainly the way in which the poem relates a very specific time and place, no longer able to exist or to be recreated, becomes a problem for Wordsworth. A number of different kinds of relation to place are voiced in Home at Grasmere, some positive and some negative. The most obvious of these is a sense of home or homecoming.
Well, I think there are a number of important aspects that Wordsworth emphasises in the poem that make up his sense of home. One is that he has a particular abode in a very specific location, and the quality of that location, Grasmere itself, is important. But what's also interesting, I think, and also overlooked in Wordsworth's sense of home, is that it's a place of community, both a specific domestic community that he's able to gather around him, with particularly the presence of his sister and his friend Coleridge. It's also a place of work. Wordsworth says in the poem, something must be done, and for him, home includes work rather than home being somewhere separate from work.
It's a tribute, isn't it? It's an utterance. It's an act of love. And like all acts of love, it tries to apprehend both the difficulties and, the obvious wonders. It's like home, really.
Another way in which Wordsworth articulates his relationship to place is by comparing himself to the inhabitants of the Vale, both human and animal. Stories about local people were later taken from Home at Grasmere and published in The Excursion in 1814. but Wordsworth's strongest identification with others comes when he compares himself and Dorothy to two swans that live on the island in the centre of the lake.
From afar they came, like Emma and myself, to live together here in peace and solitude, choosing this valley, they who had the choice of the whole world. We saw them day by day, through those 2 months of unrelenting storm, conspicuous in the centre of the lake, their safe retreat. We knew them well. They strangers, and we strangers, they a pair, and we a solitary pair like them.
I think the power of the two swans passage in Home at Grasmere comes from the fact that it introduces a sense of anxiety and loss of all that Grasmere has come to mean in the poem. The fact that Wordsworth identifies himself and Dorothy so strongly with the two swans, they've also come from afar, they're also a solitary pair, means that when these swans disappear, as they do, they raise questions about how permanent Wordsworth's and Dorothy's own inhabitants of this particular spot is. And they also emphasise, I think, one of the other key themes in the poem that unsettles the celebration of the location, which is the theme of death. Wordsworth is anxious that one of the swans may have been shot or that the swans may have died. And this highlights the possibility of death, which is a kind of dark presence throughout the poem.
It's clearly a well-conceived, a very important image of fidelity, and a couple, and beauty, being, Wordsworth imagines, attached to their one place. We have to remind ourselves in the text, he doesn't say they are dead. He says maybe they're dead, maybe they're both dead, but maybe they've flown away. And that bit of the poem always reminds me of Yeats's poem, The Wild Swans at Cool. It's clearly the idea of these wonderful wild birds being free to fly away if they choose to, while the poet remains. But in The Wild Swans at Cool, it's the existence of these swans that makes Yeats meditate in a melancholy kind of way about his present situation. It seems to me exactly comparable in Home at Grasmere. Wordsworth's mind is released to think, where are they? Perhaps they've gone. Perhaps this was not the right place for them. And then he tells you what the significance is by saying, we too, Dorothy and himself, in a sense belong and yet maybe don't belong. They too are free to go.
More recent critics have offered ecological readings of Home at Grasmere as a poem in which the poet seeks to recognise and allow the uniqueness of this vale as a thing apart. The poem is filled with descriptions of the valley, of its shelter, its sense of enclosure, its circularity, and all of these come to a climax in the poet's attempt to describe his feelings towards it.
The one sensation that is here, 'tis here, here as it found its way into my heart in childhood, here as it abides by day, by night, here only, or in chosen minds that take it with them hence, where'er they go. 'Tis, but I cannot name it, 'tis the sense of majesty and beauty and repose, a blended holiness of earth and sky, something that makes this individual spot, this small abiding place of many men, a termination and a lost retreat, a centre come from wheresoe'er you will, a whole without dependence or defect, made for itself and happy in itself, perfect contentment, unity entire.
Now, two things strike me about this passage. One is that there are no double negatives in it. Wordsworth's usual way in blank verse of trying to really punch home some positive is to say that it's not on something else. And here, he rather more firmly, directly and assertively keeps saying, it is, it is, it is. But I suppose the bigger question that must be asked about it is, does he mean it?
in that central passage from Home at Grasmere, what Wordsworth is keen to emphasise is a sense of the completeness, the unity, the entirety of the particular world he now inhabits. So elsewhere in the poem he comments on the majestic, self-sufficing nature of this world. And that's very much what he's trying to convey there, so that the natural world and the human world and the animal world are all brought together in this one particular location. What we need to remember, perhaps, are some of the elements that might seem to shadow or to undermine this attempt to create a unity entire. One is the mention there of a termination, a last retreat, which inevitably brings in the prospect of death and could be seen to darken this passage. But we also need to remember the rest of the world that is excluded from this particular microcosm. Most obviously, the urban world of the city, which is something Wordsworth could be seen to be in retreat from at this stage.
Home at Grasmere anticipates the prelude in many ways, in its autobiographical focus, in the centrality of the poet's relationship to place, and in its informal tone and structure. But it is also a poem shot through with its own uncertainties. We, as readers, know that Wordsworth will go on to produce great writings about the Lake District, identifying him with this region forever. But Wordsworth, in 1800, does not know this. The poem's weaknesses are also its strength, however. It struggles to articulate the complexities of the poet's relationship to place. It asks whether it should attempt to describe it rather than simply living in that place, as well as what it might mean to fully communicate a sense of place to someone else. All of these questions are still live for us today, not only in relation to the beauty of the Lake District, but in terms of our sense of global responsibility for the planet and for future generations. Caring about place is an essential part of what makes us human.